Welcome to On the Mark with Peter Buckley and Mark O'Donnell. Our podcast is dedicated to helping Christians target the right priorities in their apostolic and interior lives.
Well, hello and welcome once again to On the Mark. I am Peter Buckley, your host, and I want to welcome once again, joining us with his insights, as always, Mark O'Donnell. Mark, welcome.
Peter, thanks for having me and happy Thanksgiving. I hope you had a good one.
Yeah, thank you very much. Indeed, I did. As we record this, Mark, you're making it evident through the Thanksgiving good wishes. It's between the weekend of the Feast of Christ the King and the beginning of Advent. And of course, we hear Christ the King, and I think that for a lot of people, it conjures up images of thrones and chariots, and yet the King, whose arrival we'll celebrate in just a few short weeks, doesn't come in as a king as we think. He comes as a baby in a manger, surrounded by a bunch of shepherds. This idea of Christ the King, I was thinking about it as I just finished reading this book that fairly well known, The Power and the Glory, written by Graham Greene way back in 1940. Greene himself, very well known and widely acclaimed author, Oxford educated, Catholic convert. And the purpose of this episode is not to analyze that book in great, significant detail, but that actually could be fun and an interesting project. But rather to focus on a few of the main themes and then just see how they might be relevant to us today as we try to live our Catholic faith more fully and as we try to help others get closer to Christ. The book is set in Mexico. It's in the early part of the 20th century. It's a time of extreme persecution of Catholics in Mexico. And during this time, all Catholics were persecuted and priests were forbidden to practice any part of their priestly duties. I mean, they couldn't say mass, they couldn't hear confessions, they couldn't even appear in public as a priest. And the book presents to us two priests, one who effectively abandoned his vocation by acquiescing to the state's demand that priests should renounce their vocation, many, directed or guided towards getting married. And then the other priest in the book, who's the book's protagonist, who's referred to as the whiskey priest. He had many struggles, but throughout many of the struggles, including having an affair with a woman, fathering a child with that woman, having a problem with drinking, and doubts of his faith, he somehow perseveres in his ministry to the point that towards the end, it cost him his life. And so, Mark, I think this might be a good time to consider how well we are living our own vocation in a couple ways. The big V vocation, which is the call all of us have to follow Christ. And then the corollary, I guess, the smaller V vocation, which is how do we live out that call? And is it through married life or priestly life, consecrated life, or whatever that might be? And then in what theaters do we live out that particular vocation, whether it be home, an office, factory, farm, wherever. So my question to you then is, how do we persevere living our vocation through many difficulties, temptations, challenges to that vocation?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think that's really the $64,000 question. It's very hard to persevere, no question about it. So what I would do is I think we just have to try to live our individual vocation as best as we can and realize that we are going to take some artillery for doing that. And that's kind of a corporate term when someone would be, persecuted or attacked inside a company. We'd say that they were taking heavy artillery if it was really bad. If someone was going to get fired because their division wasn't performing, that type of thing. It reminds me when I started my career at Manufacturers Hanover in New York City. I was all excited. I was 23 years old. I said, this is, a great place, fun. It's a great place to work, no question about it. And after I was there a year or two, Opus Dei asked me to move to Boston to run a center in the Boston area, a small center that catered to high school and college students. And so I went to the bank and asked if I could get a transfer because Manny Hanny had an office in Boston. And so they said, sure, there's an interview process. So I went through this interview process, interviewed with the head honcho in Boston and a number of people up there. And, eventually they granted me the transfer. But in the process, they were asking me all about Opus Dei and, why I wanted to move up, to Boston from New York and so forth and so on. And so I told him all about it. I told him about the center. I told him about different things I was doing, we were going to do, and I was all excited about it. And here I am, this very enthusiastic 23-year-old newly minted director telling him all these things. And I just thought that they would enjoy hearing about it, but the reality is that wasn't always the case. And in one instance in particular, when we were assigning accounts, once I came to Boston, they assigned the Christian Science Monitor account to me. And I said, that's kind of strange. I mean, they don't do a lot of banking business. I mean, why are you giving that to me, And my boss said, well, because you're a zealot, you're really into, religion. Uh, and it's kind of the first time I'd heard, okay, I misspoke or I was too zealous when I explained why I wanted to move to Boston, but it was good, and everybody kind of laughed and, it was a good laugh at my expense. And I said, all right, I'll chalk that one up for the team. But my boss was a great guy. He was a Marine. He had been a Marine and he was in Vietnam. Very fair, very honest person. Another incident that happened there was he had a secretary and she was my age, around 23. And back in that day, people would kind of go out to lunch. Men and women would just go out to lunch together. They didn't have to be married. And, this is the beginning of the Me Too movement, unbeknownst to any of us at the time. But one day he wanted to go out with his secretary, and there's a steak place there called Lockover's, which is pretty famous in Boston. And so he said, "Hey, why don't we go out and get a quick steak and come back?" And she said, "No, I don't really want to do that." And he said, "Why is that?" And she said, "Well, it's Lent, and I don't want to eat meat during Lent." And so then he stops, and he turns and looks at me, and then he looks back at her and says, "Have you been talking to him?"
The zealot.
Yeah, the zealot's been talking to you. And you got to kind of just envision the situation because we're all in a big bullpen. There's one big room with 12 or 13 desks. It's not like we have individual offices. So everything is heard by everybody. And so once again, I had to take one for the team there. People thought it was very funny and it was somewhat embarrassing, but it was good, it was good. And these are the small examples, but it shows how our private lives and decisions influence and affect others. I mean, God is using our presence in these places to move the hearts and souls of everyone around us. At the same time, He's allowing us to be humbled and sanctified in the process. So it's really a twofer. He gets the benefit of humbling us so that we can be better receptacles of grace, and He has the benefit of getting His word through us spoken to others. And so I thought that was that was just one of many examples of kind of, rubbing up against the grain or being, I think ridicule is the first level of persecution and then it goes up from there. But it definitely is. And we can't be afraid to take it. It turns out that John was a great guy. My boss there, he gave me a great reference for my first full-time job out of MIT at General Cinema. And I was very grateful for that. My boss at General Cinema called him, unbeknownst to me, and said, "Well, tell me about this guy. Is he a good worker? La-di-da-di-da-di." And he gave me a great reference. And my boss at General Cinema told me, I talked to him, and he spoke very highly of you and recommended you. And he wanted you to stay there and work there. And so you never know. I mean, on the surface, people can kind of give you a hard time, but underneath, there's something going on there. And in this case, John uh, was a great asset for me, and I'm very grateful for that because that was the best job I ever had in my career for 5 years at General Cinema. So it's, I
Yeah,
think,
I've had those
yeah,
experiences too. I mean, so they can be demeaning for sure, and they're not fun, but they really do strengthen us. So let's leave New York back in the heyday, and go back to 20th century Mexico. Towards the end of the book, we're presented with one of the priests, the protagonist, facing death by execution. And simultaneous with that event, in the book, the author presents the scene of a mother reading a story to her son about another priest facing execution. And I don't think, I can't recall in the book, but I don't think the priest is given a name. But this priest's death is likely inspired by the death by execution of Blessed Miguel Pro, a priest who had an opportunity in real life to save his life by renouncing his Catholic faith. And yet he bravely stood in front of a firing squad, declaring very famously, Viva Cristo Rey, long live Christ the King. And there he stood with a crucifix in one hand, rosary beads in another, and he prayed for the forgiveness of his executioners, and then he was martyred for the faith. It was clear to Blessed Miguel Pro that Christ was his king, and equally evident that the Blessed Mother was his queen. And so, Mexico and Mary, there's a very nice, beautiful, long relationship. We know the effect the Virgin of Guadalupe had in converting Mexico into a predominantly Catholic country. We see evidence of that great devotion to Mary in the life of and death of Blessed Miguel. What do these examples of faith in Mary say to us about how we should live a devotion to Mary?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think Mary, we can kind of romanticize Mary's life, and that's a mistake. Because our Lord, God made her, she had to suffer just like us, and yet she didn't have original sin. I mean, if you just look at the different scenes in the gospel where she's mentioned, right? Almost all of them involve some level of anxiety and suffering. I mean, even the Annunciation, when Gabriel appears to her, the gospel says she was greatly troubled. Greatly troubled. Well, who wouldn't be if some guy just appears in your room and starts talking to you and tells you to calm down? That's the last thing you want to say. But he tells her, and so she's got to think on her feet, and she doesn't know exactly what to do, but she's full of grace, and so she says yes on the spot. Thanks be to God. But then you look when she and Joseph go to Bethlehem, and there's no room in the inn. I mean, that's a nice romantic story, but that must have been very high anxiety for both of them. There's no room. She's going to have a child. Then they have Jesus in the stable, and then a day or two later, in the middle of the night, get up. You got to go to Egypt. Herod wants to kill the kid. Okay, they're running for their lives, literally running for their lives. And then when Jesus is lost in the temple when he's 12, for 3 days they're looking for him. I mean, these are serious levels of anxiety that any normal person, we would consider that serious. Uh,
For sure.
and so if he's going to afflict her with that, he's going to afflict us with it. And so we just have to go to Our Lady. And I like to call her the Queen of Endurance because I think she really helps us to endure these trials because she did it. And that's what we need to do. So this novena that's coming up, I would just take your most difficult intentions to her, your most challenging problem, your addictions, your unemployment, your relationship failures, and just ask her to heal those, to cure those during the novena. And pray for your colleagues as well during the novena. I mean, we all have colleagues who are far from God. And I think this is interesting, Peter, because in a recent interview on the Opus Dei website, the prelate was talking to the Pope, and back in 2017, he mentioned when he first met Pope Francis said, "Well, I really want Opus Dei to deal, to help middle class and professional people. That that's your periphery." Pope Francis is famous for go to the peripheries, and we often think of that means go to Bangladesh or Calcutta or Africa, the Sudan, and that's certainly periphery in some sense. But there's also the periphery of the office.
Yeah.
People are just deadly. They're dead to God, so they're terribly lonesome. And so we're trying to bring Christ to that periphery. I think that's what we really have to focus on. I really do, because it's somewhat easy to say, okay, I'm going to go and hand out sandwiches to people under bridges in Boston, and that's a good thing. But you're clearly in control of the situation. You've got the goods and you're giving it to someone who needs it. And whereas at the office, that's not the case. People at the office are self-sufficient. So now you've got to win them over in a different way. And you have to win them over with the conviction of your beliefs and with love, with understanding and attention. And people they recognize that. So that's the Christ in us. So Mary can help us develop that. so that we can see the opportunity right in front of us, which, I missed for decades. I'll be honest with you. We all kind of write off people. Oh, this person's divorced, or that person hasn't been to church in 10 years. I mean, just say hi and don't waste your time talking to them. But the reality is that's where God has placed us. That's where we should struggle to bring him. And then, and I think that's really exciting, actually. It doesn't get any public acknowledgement. I think that's what's hard for people. It's not going to be on the news, that and yet that's okay because a lot of the gospel, Jesus just had these like private meetings with people who needed help, and we know it because the Holy Spirit inspired the divine writers to write about it, right? But we never would have known like about the Samaritan woman, right? Unless St. John wrote about it. That never would have made any news story. We never would have known about Bartimaeus unless, there was some disturbance, down the road, and it turns out some blind guy was, yelling. But so I think it's hard because it requires humility on our part that I'm not going to be in the limelight. I'm going to kind of just work the turf that God has asked me to work. And I think that's a critical aspect of our vocation as lay people. There's no real structure to it, so it's hard for people to understand that. But once they get it, I'm telling you, there's so many opportunities right there in our lives already that
I think it's a very good point as you're mentioning as we do approach the time on December 8th where we can start that novena to the Immaculate Conception. What we can really bring to mind and bring to Our Lady are the intentions of our, colleagues, our professional associations, and so forth. So I think it's really good advice. Just getting back to the story, it was said again in 1920s Mexico. We have this priest who was martyred, Blessed Miguel Pro was martyred in 1927. And, this is a novel, but I mean, in Pro's life was real, but the persecutions of Christians persist to this day. And they occur in many ways. I mean, not the least of which is martyrdom. I mean, which we see throughout the world. But the less traumatic are the common, perhaps daily persecutions we find for those who are willing to witness to the faith in faces in perhaps situations where there are real consequences, where you could lose your job. I mean, you could lose a opportunity for promotion, or you could potentially end a relationship and so forth. And so maybe, Mark, you can tell us just, expound on this if you could a little bit, how we can maintain the sense of fortitude in the midst of some of these, I guess I should say, small p persecutions that we might face.
sure. That's good. That's another great question. I think we can't be afraid to go out and bear witness and speak of what we've seen and heard. And I'm speaking mostly about the workplace. At home you can do that and people can kind of argue and kids can believe or not believe. And, it's kind of a controlled environment more or less, right? But it's different in the workplace. And it doesn't mean that we have to go out and always speak. Just our presence can be very helpful to other people. And the fact that we're patient in the face of a very difficult situation. We talked in a prior podcast about, I was working for Allied Signal in Rhode Island, the automotive aftermarket, and, it was a very intense environment for everybody. Everyone was under a lot of stress. About 30% of the people were taking medication for anxiety. And we had a hard charging boss, and who was under a lot of stress as well. And so that just kind of flowed down on everyone. And that made it very difficult for people. And when I interviewed there and they offered me the job, I said, yeah, I'd love to take it. And the woman from HR said, look, I don't want you to take this job until you talk to the president, because this is not an easy place to work. I mean, she was like trying to talk me out of it. It's the only
Hmm.
time it's ever happened, but she's basically looking, don't get too excited. And once I got in there, I started working. I realized, yeah, this is very stressful. It was very stressful for me. And because I had my faith, because I had the plan of life, because I was trying to pray, because I was trying to ask Our Lady every day for help, I was able to kind of be a support for other people to some extent. Not as much as I should have been, but to some extent. And I was able to smile when it was difficult, and that's why the president used to call me Smiley, when the shit hit the fan and we didn't make our numbers and no one knew what to do, you just rely on your
You're
divine
standing over in
affiliation.
the corner smiling.
Well, I'm
He's
just
like,
like, what
who
what
is
do
this
we
guy?
do? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know what we can do at this point. Let's keep trying, but let's not let it destroy us. And that only comes from faith. So that's a witness to the faith, right? And you take a little bit of ridicule by being called Smiley, and everybody starts calling you Smiley and making fun of you. But that's okay. I mean, but
No
the
longer the zealot. You go from the
exactly,
zealot
yeah,
to Smiley. Yeah. The Smiley zealot.
that's. But those are the things I think, because it may happen where people come in and say, all right, and I have had situations. I mean, I've had four different situations where I lost jobs because I, I was a numeraire in Opus Dei and it came out in the interview process in some capacity. And it didn't work out. They said it wasn't going to be a good fit or words to that effect. And so that does happen. It definitely does happen. But I think the more, those are kind of one-off events where you just kind of take the spear and it's over, you know, you're dead. Uh, these other ones, I think a lot of people are in job situations where they're under stress. I mean, can you imagine working just read the biography of Elon Musk by Walter Isaacson. Can you imagine working at some of those companies where it was extraordinarily stressful for the people? It's all public record there. That's not that uncommon. And so a lot of people that are listening to us are probably in jobs that they don't really love, that are hard, that they're trying to survive and to pay the bills for their family. And there's no overt persecution, but there's kind of a dehumanization process, I guess you could call it. It doesn't just affect Catholics, it affects anyone working in the place. But you need to get the money, you need the job. So I would,
So I guess, yeah, I
go
mean,
ahead. We're going
so
off
we've,
here. I'm sorry we're
no,
getting
it's
away
good. No,
from
no, it's good.
guilt.
But it's these, again, these small p persecutions and these being subjected to demeaning comments and these embarrassments and so forth. Is it all worth it, right? I mean, wouldn't it be easier just to adopt an attitude like the other, the first priest mentioned in Green's book, who said the heck with it. He renounced his faith and his role as a priest and submissively marries to save his life. And to answer that, yeah, we know the sacrifice is worth it. And you look again to Blessed Miguel Pro. I mean, he was about to be executed. His executioners, the agents of the state who were suppressing religion, thought, okay, we're going to take a photo of him and we're going to use as an example to try to suppress the resistance of those who were trying to restore religion to Mexican life. And it was a colossal backfire. I mean, the photo ended up, it was him with outstretched arms, accepting his death and becoming a rallying cry, this Vivo Cristo Rey, long live Christ the King, that spread the rebellion to restore religion to Mexico. So what lesson can we learn from this? How can we take the challenges, the persecutions we might encounter, the being called Smiley, the zealots, of course, much on a much smaller scale, but use that as a model of witness to try to bring others to the faith?
Well, I think just trying to accept it with joy, it sounds, and I think that's what strikes people as, shocking because everyone else has kind of got their head down and everyone else is kind of afraid. But if you're willing to speak the truth in your environment, and when I say this truth, it doesn't mean it has to be the religious truth. Maybe it's just the truth about the business or the situation that we're in or how we should deal with a big customer. Um, And you have to be good at what you're doing. There's no question about it, but you also want to be truthful. You're going to find that people want to work with you, because they want that. They want that environment. Um, and let's face it, I mean, persecution is foretold to us in the Gospels. Our Lord says they will seize and persecute you. They will hand you over to the synagogues and to prisons. They will have you led before kings and governors because of my name. It will lead to your giving testimony. Remember, you are not to prepare your defense beforehand, for I myself shall give you a wisdom in speaking that all your adversaries will be powerless to resist or refute. You will even be handed over by parents, brothers, relatives, and friends, and they will put some of you to death. You will be hated by all because of my name, but not a hair of your head will be destroyed. By your perseverance, you will secure your lives. Once again, getting back to Mary, Queen of Endurance, pray for us. I mean, she'll help us to persevere. I mean, she's there at the foot of the cross for 3 hours watching her son die. That's incredibly difficult, and she does that. She endures that, and even though he's totally innocent, she knows what's up. She knows why he's doing it. And so, we have to ask her for the help because I don't think there's any easy answer, really. I think the easiest answer is we have to help each other, encourage each other. And that's, why the pagans said, look at the Christians, see how they love one another, the mandatum novum. And I don't think we do a great job of that. Um, but
Don't do a great job of what? Of
of
demonstrating love
of help,
of
yeah,
one another.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. I mean, this is, we just kind of, we're glad we don't suffer the same fate that they're suffering.
Hmm.
You know, for instance, if somebody loses a job, okay, well, gee, that's too bad. I'm sorry to hear that. Yeah, I'll pray for you. And if I happen to know someone who can help you, maybe I'll let you know, right? And the guy keeps going on. Well, I mean, have we ever thought about just giving him a check for 10 grand? Say, look, here, so you don't get foreclosed on. Here's some money and get get out there, and I'll pray for you as well. All of a sudden, it's like, whoa, it's not going to solve the guy's problems, but maybe it gives him, a 2 month window to work. And then he's got a couple months of severance. Okay, now he's got, a little extra runway to get something going. I mean, we can't be afraid of being that, I mean, we see that, right, with our friends who are sick up in New Hampshire, and how we get these emails about how they're doing, and the outpouring of love and the hundreds of people delivering meals. I mean, that's a great story of charity. But there are also stories of, where, you know, uh, I knew a guy who used to meet with other friends after work for drinks occasionally, like weekly, and he had a hard time professionally, and he didn't really want to talk about it. And then his wife left him, and then the next thing we know, he killed himself. And it's like, well, why didn't I reach out to him before that? Why didn't I know have the antennae up to kind of really help people, not just pat them on the back, but to, so delivering meals, giving them money, praying, of course. I mean, yeah, in addition to the material and to the spiritual works of mercy or spiritual sustenance, material. And if that hurts, that's why we're here. That's why we have the money. I mean, I understand everyone wants to save until they're 190 years old, but it's like, ain't gonna happen. I mean, use it when you have it to help others. And so if you're not going to give it to Mother Teresa, give it to your unemployed friend who's going to lose his house and his marriage could break up because of it.
Yeah, that's
Those are
very
just
good.
some ideas, to
That's
make it
good.
more concrete.
Well, that's great, Mark. So let's leave it there. And I want to thank you once again. And again, we leave this, at least the formal recognition of the Christ the King. We never leave the sense of Christ being our King. And we now will enter into the season of Advent. And this, of course, is times for Christmas trees to go up. Um, Homes will be lit up and so forth. I'm sure you probably started to hear Christmas music already. And interestingly, somewhere between hearing, Baby is Cold Outside and Jingle Bell Rock, there is actually a pretty interesting anthem praising Christ the King from the most unlikely of sources. And it's Mariah Carey singing, Jesus, oh, what a wonderful child. And I'll spare you the my singing version of it. But in the lyrics, it says, Jesus, Jesus, oh, what a wonderful child. Jesus, Jesus, so lowly, meek, and mild. New life, new hope, new joy he brings. Won't you listen to the angels sing? Glory, glory, glory to the newborn King. Vivo el Cristo Rey. Long live Christ the King.
Thanks for listening to On the Mark with Peter Buckley and Mark O'Donnell. If you enjoy our podcast, be sure to follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify to be notified every time Peter and Mark release a new episode. And visit us on the web at onthemark.show.